So now you know about the endocrine function of the pancreas and the pancreatic islets. Alpha cells, glucagon, beta cells, insulin, and they work together in harmony to make sure that you have an adequate blood glucose level so that your cells can be fed whenever they're hungry. And in type 2 diabetes, one of our problems is that we have this high blood glucose. We have some glucose going into the cells, but not enough, and so we still have a lot of cellular dysfunction also occurring for our type 2 diabetes. And so we will also see with those individuals elevated triglycerides as well as elevated cholesterol levels, because not all cells are being fed equally of what little bit of glucose we can get into them, and so they will be supplementing their diet with the same type of material that a insulin-dependent diabetic would actually utilize if they didn't have any insulin. They would be utilizing their triglycerides and cholesterols in order to help feed their cells. Now let's go to the next little endocrine gland. That's part of our chapter here, the pineal gland. Our notes here say it's a tiny gland hanging from the roof of the third ventricle. I don't really like that description all that much because in order for us to first see the pineal gland, remember the sheep's brain. You took the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum, and from the superior posterior aspect, you kind of increased the angle, or you separated them somewhat so that you look down in there and see the pineal gland sitting on top of that area that was called the corpora quadrigemina externally. And so that's its location. The pineal gland, remember, is also called the epithalamus. It is indeed a tiny gland hanging from that area, and it is responsible for producing a hormone that is called melatonin. It is produced by the predominant cells of the pineal gland. They're called pinealocytes. And melatonin is interesting in that it has a diurnal pattern. So we'll have high levels and low levels, fluctuating high and low levels that occurs in a similar fashion, high and low, on a day-to-day basis. So you'll see this high at a certain time of day and low at another specific time of the day. The high will be when things are dark, such as when you're sleeping. So it's interesting about melatonin. It needs light or the lack of light to actually stimulate its production. So at night, with our eyes closed, our melatonin levels are quite high. Also, at night, with the light levels lowering, our melatonin levels start to rise. So melatonin is a hormone that is commonly associated with helping us to sleep. And indeed, for many, many people, it has a significant impact on a normal sleep cycle for them, but not for all. So the pineal gland is getting some impulses from our visual pathways. So as we're looking at things with our eyes open, there's a little track that's heading off to the pineal glands, letting them know, yes, our eyes are open and here's some light. And that light will actually inhibit melatonin release. So during the daytime, when our eyes are open and we're in well-lit areas, we have very low melatonin levels. At night, or when it's getting dark outside, our melatonin levels rise and peak while we're sleeping. As soon as we open our eyes, our melatonin levels will actually start to drop. Melatonin is an interesting hormone. It's easily available for purchase over the counter. I do have to caution you guys about supplements because the supplement industry is not regulated, and so there's a lot of contaminants in a lot of products out there. Melatonin is not typically one of the supplements out there that has a lot of contaminants, but the producers of these supplements don't have to have as high quality control standards as we do by those industries that are regulated, such as the drug industry. And you may have not necessarily the proper levels of melatonin listed in the supplement as it has on the label. That's actually in the real pill. For some people with insomnia, they can take melatonin and it will really help their sleep, and the dosage will vary based upon that individual's responsiveness to melatonin. I myself, when I took melatonin for trying to help treat jet lag, hoping to sleep better on the airplane, found that the melatonin just made me more fidgety and difficulty with a good deep sleep, and gave me what felt like nightmares when I did actually get into a little bit of a sleep cycle itself. So melatonin goes in the toilet for me. Other people swear by it. The other interesting thing about melatonin, it does have some anti-gonadotropic features to it. So the word anti means against, gonad means against your gonads, and indeed will actually suppress the release of testosterone for men, estrogen, progesterone for women, in the aspect that it is typically anti-gonadotropic best for individuals before puberty. So before puberty, we actually don't want high testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone levels. And so melatonin helps to actually keep a young person from actually going into puberty until the proper cycle of that person's genetic makeup time is ready for them to do that. Typically 11 for women, 12, 13 for men. So its anti-gonadotropic properties are more prominent in children, and it prevents that thing called precocious puberty or early onset puberty. I would caution anybody, though, who is taking melatonin and they're starting to feel more grouchy and grumpy, that maybe they should not take it because it might be having some anti-gonadotropic properties or effects on them. The thymus, that is our final gland that we're going to talk about. That's part of our endocrine chapter. The thymus is an interesting gland. In our notes, it says deep to the sternum, but basically it's between your sternum and your heart, and in a more superior location, not an inferior location on your heart, more upper towards the neck area. The thymus is mostly active when you are a newborn, child, and young adolescent. It definitely decreases in size after puberty. And when you investigate it, it actually looks mostly like a bunch of adipose tissue and CT. There's still some thymus in there, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Indeed, when we are born, the thymus is pretty big and pretty generous between the heart and the sternum of newborns, and remains very large in that area when we're young children. And then once we hit puberty, that huge size of our thymus starts to actually definitely decrease in size, and when we become very old, you can hardly recognize any sort of thymic tissue. The hormone from the thymus is called thymic hormone, and it is responsible for differentiation of a certain type of white blood cell. This white blood cell is called a lymphocyte. It will cause the lymphocyte to become a very specific type of lymphocyte called a T cell or T cell lymphocyte. So the thymus is indeed very much responsible for a big player in our immune system, the T cell lymphocyte. It will take our lymphocytes, train it to be a T cell, and the T cell will be out there to help protect us against cancers and things along that line. And that's what's really interesting. When you're born, you are exposed to this horrible world of all kinds of bacteria, viruses, fungi, prions, all kinds of stuff. And so your thymus is big, and it's working on training your cells to handle this outside world. And its training requires several years, and then the training has been instituted, and then you don't need your thymus so much because we have a very good T cell lymphocyte supply that can actually reproduce. We'll talk about that more when we get into that chapter. The interesting thing, though, is not all things are perfect. And so one of the things that we notice is that as we age, indeed, our incidence of cancers increase, which also correlates with our decreasing thymic gland function. As far as childhood cancers, it also shows that there was a problem with the thymus adequately training those T cells to properly recognize cancer. So nothing's perfect, but that's a very important function of our thymus to help build up a very important branch of our immune system. Let's go into the last portion of this chapter. It's called General Adaptation Syndrome that we want to talk about now, abbreviated GAS, I guess just for fun. With the General Adaptation Syndrome, this situation is not designed to actually give us homeostasis. It's designed to save our lives. So right here when it says counteract stress, it is a system that is built into us that is designed to help us survive a catastrophic event. And if we do not handle the catastrophic event properly and seek outside intervention, the general adaptation syndrome will actually cause us to meet our demise when we actually undergo cellular and total body organ exhaustion and failure. So let's look at a few terms here. Eustress. True stress. In essence, a small amount of stress is good. And actually, if you don't realize it, when you get up in the morning, get out of your bed, you're already applying some eustress to yourself. So you were relaxed, sleeping nicely, and now you're getting up and you're going to have to interact with all kinds of people out there in the outside world. And your cortisol levels, were elevated at this time to help you actually handle this amount of stress of getting up and dealing with the outside world. So this is a good thing. Distress is destructive stress, and destructive stress, which of course our note says is harmful, is bad because it lowers our immune response and leads to the general adaptation syndrome, trying to actually see if we can put into motion things that will save our lives. And unfortunately, if we don't have something helping us to save our life and intervene, this general adaptation syndrome ultimately will cause our demise. I know that many things that you experience in life you feel some distress about, but that is truly not true distress, lowering your immune system and causing actually cellular destruction. It is still eustress. So a little bit of stress is out there for survival, and it's to make sure all systems are functioning properly. The stressor in the general adaptation syndrome is any stress that turns it on or initiates this. And our notes here say in parentheses, bacteria, bleeding, and even emotions. And when I say bacteria, I'm talking about a very bad case of pneumonia. I'm talking about meningitis. I'm talking about sepsis. I'm talking about more than just a pimple or a boil. I'm talking about bacteria that's actually overwhelming an organ system. Bleeding, now this is not just that you cut your finger, this is you cut your arm off or you're hemorrhaging. And then emotions. And as far as emotions go that that can initiate the general adaptation syndrome, that is a severe emotional impact of somebody that you lose close to. Say your child, your spouse, somebody that was very near and dear to you. Because there are many people that you've heard about that their spouse passes away and not long after they pass away also. And that's because the general adaptation syndrome was initiated in them and they chose not to do anything about it. It just takes a little bit longer in that type of process for it to finally have its ultimate effect on an individual. This system is controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for turning the system on, and so these stressors will actually reach the hypothalamus with this type of information, and then the hypothalamus will make the decision to turn on two pathways that it has very significant control over. One, because the hypothalamus is neural tissue, it's going to be a neural pathway that it's going to turn on, but also because we told you the hypothalamus is part of the endocrine system, it's going to turn on a hormonal mechanism. And it turns them both on at the same time. However, the one that you feel first is the one that is the quickest to respond, and that's going to be the neural system. And that system is referred to as the alarm reaction, or the alarm branch of this general adaptation syndrome. And the sympathetic portion of the hypothalamic ANS control will be turned on, and it will stimulate the body as well as the adrenal medulla, which of course will then release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream to help augment and boost the response of our alarm reaction. So the alarm reaction is the initial reaction we feel to the stressor. It is sympathetically controlled, so therefore we call it our fight-flight activation of the nervous system. And this is turned on because when we initiate the general adaptation syndrome, we don't know exactly what is causing our problem, so we're going to have this generic response to the insult or to the stressor. And so the activities of the alarm reaction are designed to counteract immediate danger. Hence fight-flight. We know this is quick to start, but we also know it fatigues, so it is short-lived. And we try to enhance the longevity of this by actually dumping adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream to augment it. So this is what the alarm reaction will do to various organ systems. So this is sympathetic activation of the heart. What will it do to the heart? Well, it will increase the force of contraction as well as rate of contraction. What will it do to the brain? Well, it will increase blood circulation, so it will cause vasodilation, because we want to get as much blood supply to the brain to help us figure out how to get out of this situation. Also, skeletal muscle, what will it do to the blood vessels in skeletal muscle? It will actually cause vasodilation, because remember, this is a non-discriminate activation of fight-flight. So when we want to flight or fight, we will need our skeletal muscles. Lungs, same thing. We need to have superior air exchange. And so we will have vasodilation too in the lungs. In addition to that, we will have increased respiratory function to have better gas exchange. Skin. Well, when somebody has a heart attack, they don't look pink. They sure do not. And the reason they look pale is because the skin will vasoconstrict. And our skin is actually considered a bit of a blood reservoir. So we're going to shunt much needed blood into the central circulation so we can distribute it to areas that are going to help us survive this event. Urinary system. Well, who cares if you make any urine right now? You need to survive first. So we'll get vasoconstriction and therefore decrease urine output. Digestive will also get vasoconstriction and decreased digestive processes. And so we'll get decreased salivation, decreased enzyme release, things along that line, dry mouth, all that stuff. Another interesting thing is our spleen happens to be a bit of a bag of blood, and it actually has the capacity to contract somewhat and force a little extra blood into our general circulation. The liver, it's a wonderful organ. It's going to help break down glycogen into glucose, put that glucose into the bloodstream, because we've got to actually feed a lot of these processes that we've beefed up now here. The adrenal medulla, remember, we're going to be releasing adrenaline, which is epinephrine, norepinephrine, epi 75%, norepi 25%, and put that into the bloodstream so that we can prolong our fight-flight processes and augment them. It will help prolong it somewhat, but it too will actually be broken down and no longer felt as strongly as it was in the beginning. Now, the alarm reaction is nervous or sympathetic nervous system control, and now we're going to look at the resistance reaction, which is a hormonally controlled process. We turn them both on at the same time, but remember, this process is slow to start. But lasts a long time. And this is because the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary to release various hormones, and also it's telling the adrenal cortex to release various hormones. So hypothalamus is releasing hormones to cause anterior pituitary to release hormones, which will also cause the adrenal cortex to release various hormones, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. But remember, this is designed to allow the body to fight the stressor long after the alarm reaction has given out. Some of the major hormones for the resistance reaction is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, will cause the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And this time, because of all of the ongoing events that are actually occurring, this will also impact not just the release of our glucocorticoids, but will cause the release of aldosterone. This is not normal. This is not a normal process, because ACTH is going to impact mostly our glucocorticoids. So we can make more glucose to fuel all of these events that are occurring, and we'll be making glucose from the breakdown of fats as well as proteins, using amino acids as our building blocks to help us make glucose. But in this instance, with this perfect storm, ACTH will also impact aldosterone. And when aldosterone is released because of this resistance reaction, we will uptake sodium. In other words, we will preserve sodium in our system, and keeping sodium in our system maintains the fluids in our system, for example, for hemorrhage, as well as an ion balance. But if we're actually saving sodium and water, we have to do this at the expense of potassium. So we are now dumping potassium into our urine. That's not so cool. Let's take a look in the long run. Let's take a look at the next hormone we have listed here for the resistance reaction. Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will cause thyroid stimulating hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary, which will cause thyroid hormone to be released, which will then increase our carbohydrate catabolism and also augment or ramp up the metabolic processes, because remember, that's our major metabolic hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone from our hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to also release growth hormone, and this will cause increased fat catabolism. Remember, catabolism is to break down. So it is also going to help us break down fat so that we can have enough nutrients available for us for this catastrophic event. So we're losing fat. Now, alarm reaction will fatigue and give out. Resistance reaction will take over and carry you through. However, you have to have some sort of outside intervention. You know, people who have bacterial meningitis or bacterial sepsis or bacterial pneumonia, they have to be on antibiotics in order to survive. So some outside intervention has to take place, because if that intervention doesn't occur, this resistance reaction will roll on and actually ultimately cause your demise in that final aspect of the general adaptation syndrome. Cellular and organ exhaustion and dysfunction. So here we have exhaustion, not just that you're tired. This is at the cellular level and therefore at the organ system level. Exhaustion will occur if we do not have proper intervention for all of those bacterial infections, but also ketoacidosis is a perfect example of this process. So ketoacidosis, for somebody who has insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, we know the person will die, and the reason they die is because of C. Exhaustion occurs because, one, the alarm reaction didn't stop it, and two, the resistance reaction didn't stop it. The process is still going on, and now the resistance reaction is contributing to your overall demise. Well, let's take a look here at what happens with exhaustion at the microscopic and therefore macroscopic level. Well, we have all this fat catabolism occurring because of growth hormone as well as glucocorticoids. So we have a loss of body fat, and that's bad because fat's kind of like our storage energy form. And if we run out of our storage form of energy, we are going to be running out of energy and therefore ATP. And that's why we have here energy demands. Got rid of our body fat, and the energy demands have to be met. And if they are not met, things will totally go in the can. Let's take a look at the other thing that's happening. We were talking about potassium being lost, and indeed, we will have extracellular potassium loss occurring due to that aldosterone that is being continually produced and released because of this perfect storm here. Well, one of the things that's important to realize, I like the number 4 in a lot of these processes and numbers to remember. A potassium level of 4 is great. A sodium level of 140 is great. A pH of 7.4 for your blood is great. So one of the things that you have to realize is potassium levels in our bloodstream are not very high, but they are at the right level for perfect cellular function. Nerve cells, muscle cells, heart muscle cells, etc. And if we start losing our potassium, going below 4, going down to 3.0, for example, we are getting into a very dangerous area. And so what our cells will do is they will then give us potassium. So that's why here, C, cells then lose intracellular potassium because they are trying to replace that lost extracellular potassium. So if you're getting down to 3, the cells are going, uh-oh, this is going to really impact my neuronal function. So let's go ahead and start donating our potassium to the extracellular environment. In doing so, that causes a cell's potassium level to lower. And this is same as if we were hyperpolarizing a neuron, for example. So even neurons will be doing this. So we'll be giving up their potassium to try and help the extracellular potassium level. So we will start hyperpolarizing our neurons, and we will affect other cells that are very dependent upon a very specific intracellular and extracellular potassium levels to function properly. When we lose that intracellular potassium, because we've lost our extracellular potassium, we are also, because things have been going on for a bit too long, such as in diabetic ketoacidosis, we will try to put back and have a more normal resting membrane potential for our neurons and other cells by actually taking hydrogen ions, which are protons, and putting them inside the cell. So what we'll do is we will now take the hydrogen ions, which are in excess in the extracellular environment, and we will electrochemically balance our cell. Well, this problem is that we are now acidifying our cell. So now our cell is becoming acidified. We're having potassium deficiency. And the other thing that's happening is, while all this while all this ion exchange is occurring, the water is actually following the potassium for a change. Because as this process is occurring, the individual is actually undergoing a dehydration process. So water will follow the potassium, which is now also dehydrating the cell. So we have an acidified, dehydrated cell, and this cannot be sustained for very long. We have to replete, and we have to rehydrate and get rid of those protons and stuff like that. In order for the cell to function, we have to also get it back enough potassium. And so in order to fix, like somebody who's in DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, when they come in, they will be their heart rate will be up, their respiratory rate will be up, even their temperature will be up because of the thyroid hormone that's being released. They will be skinny, they will have no body fat, and they will be at the end of their rope unless it's actually recognized quickly. And one of the first things that they do for treatment of diabetic ketoacidosis is not the administration of insulin. If you give them insulin, you will actually finish the snowball towards their doom. The first thing that has to be done for these people is you have to rehydrate them. And they can take 2 bags of saline or half normal saline or Ringer's lactate. They can hang those bottles, those bags, not bottles anymore, bags up and put 2 whole bags into an individual, and they've just touched the tip of that iceberg of their dehydration. And then they're going to be drawing blood on that individual, obviously, to see what the blood glucose level is, but they're wanting to check on the electrolytes. They're checking the sodium and potassium levels in. And even if the potassium level looks close to normal, say 3 or 3.5, they know that that person is total potassium deficient. And if they don't give them potassium next, which is what they typically do, give them potassium next before they give them the insulin, they still will have actually exacerbated the problem of cellular exhaustion for that individual. So DKA, people come in, they need fluids, they need potassium, and then they need insulin. And typically it's in that sequence unless things have changed a lot, which I don't believe they have. So that's the end of that chapter for us. So chapters 16 and 17 are going to be on exam 1. Make sure you take this opportunity to completely go through the material, and remember, you do have an opportunity to come and do a little bit of study group type of behavior or activities on Monday at noon here. I do want to touch on our next chapter, which is chapter 18, the blood. And we'll just get into the very first portion of this, composition of blood and function. I call blood go-go juice. And the reason I call it go-go juice is because if you've ever met anybody who's severely anemic, who actually is so anemic that they do qualify for a blood transfusion, once you give them the blood, they are a totally new person. They go, oh my gosh, I can just do anything now. I didn't realize how bad I felt until they got an appropriate amount of blood in their bloodstream. Now, they have fluid in their bloodstream, so it's not that they're fluid deficient, but they're deficient in the red blood cells, which are so vital for carrying oxygen to our cells at the cellular level so that they can function properly in their formation of ATP and therefore fuel the various cellular processes of our cells. So I like to call blood go-go juice. People can get up and go and take care of business at that time. Let's take a look at our little centrifuge. That was an interesting experiment for some of you with that Learn Smart Lab. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is that they gave you 5 samples, but in order for anything to be properly centrifuged, it has to be balanced on both sides. So as depicted in this picture, if you have a tube on one side, you have to have a tube of similar volume on the other side. And so with 5 samples, you actually needed to do a double of 1 so that you could make sure that the centrifuge was properly balanced in order for the experiment to proceed appropriately. Once the blood is centrifuged, it has 3 distinct separations that you will find, with the more heavier products at the bottom. And the heavier products are our red blood cells, or our erythrocytes, and it's about 44-45% of the volume of whole blood. The next layer up from the bottom, which is super, super tiny and skinny, is called the buffy coat, and it's going to be less than 1% of the volume of our blood. And the bulk of the blood is actually plasma, and that's going to be the fluid component of our blood, and it's about 55% of what we call whole blood here. We'll get into serum and plasma a little bit later when we talk about clotting. Our notes state here the components of blood fit into 2 distinct categories. There's 3 distinct layers in a centrifuge tube of blood, and we have 2 distinct categories here. Formed elements, cells and platelets. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and then plasma, the non-living viscous fluid portion of our blood. We'll talk about what makes it viscous or slimy in just a moment. 3 distinct characteristics of blood. It has a very specific pH level. I always remember that 7.4. 4.0 for potassium, 140 for sodium, and 7.4 for blood pH. So 4 just works for me. So pH ranges that are considered normal or homeostatic for us is 7.35 to 7.45. Well, 7.4 in a chemistry lab is actually alkaline, but for us that is our neutral pH. So in saying that, if I have a blood pH of 7.25, I am acidotic. Also, if I have a blood pH of 7.47, I am alkalotic, or basic. So you have to realize acidosis and alkalosis for a human being is a little bit different than in a pure chemistry lab. So anything below 7.35 is acidotic, anything above 7.45 is alkalotic. As far as volume of blood in an individual, men typically have 5 to 6 liters of blood within their circulatory system, and women will have a liter less, and that's because women are indeed of a smaller frame and therefore smaller intravascular volume. Blood is also contained within a closed circulatory system. And it's kind of hard at first to realize that we need to know that or remember that, because we always think about blood carrying oxygen to our cells. And our red blood cells do not come into contact with the cells that oxygen is delivered to. Our red blood cells always stay within the vascular tree or vascular network, and the gases that they give to the cells have to literally diffuse to the cells through our blood vessels into the interstitial fluid and finally into the cells. So that's why it's important for you to realize our blood is strictly within a closed circulatory system. So heart, arteries, capillaries, veins. Heart, arteries, capillaries, veins. And that's the way it goes. And it doesn't leave that system unless there's trauma to that system. The function of blood? Well, three main functions: transportation or distribution, and regulation, as well as protection. Transportation or distribution, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we need to take oxygen to our cells, and we need to take carbon dioxide away from our cells and to our lungs to be off-gassed. Metabolic waste, cells make waste, and so we need to collect those wastes and take them to the proper organs for disposal. Hormones, we make hormones. They need to get to our target organs via the circulatory system, as well as nutrients. With regulation, because of a constant circulatory pattern, we are able to maintain a nice constant body temperature. So the warmer core warms up the blood, and then it gets cooled off a little bit in the periphery, and so we are able to maintain an overall temperature of our various organ systems because of this circulating effect of blood to warmer areas, cooler areas, etc. pH, blood itself, is able to help buffer our pH and therefore is responsible for some of our pH control. Fluid volume, indeed, the circulation of our blood to various areas will cause us to retain more fluid or less fluid, such as with the kidneys, and so that fluid volume is distributed properly to all of the organs that need proper hydration and fluid administration themselves. Protection, two main protective features of blood is clotting. So we have components in our blood which help us to prevent blood loss, and we call that process of preventing blood loss clotting. And then we have components in our blood, white blood cells and antibodies that function in immunity and protect us from the pathogens and the bad things of the outside world. The last little component that we'll talk about before we stop our recording here is, let's talk about the plasma, which is previously discussed, 55% of our volume of whole blood. And components of plasma, 92% is good old-fashioned water, and it will contain electrolytes, nutrients, hormones, wastes, dissolved gases, and more. – 7 to 8% of the plasma is actually proteins. And our main plasma protein, which makes up the bulk of the plasma protein, is albumin. Albumin also itself is a buffer, but like eggs, albumin is what gives our blood its sliminess. So the albumin of eggs is kind of slimy, and our blood albumin is also slimy and gives blood its viscosity. So let me buffer plus viscosity. So that's all we're going to say about plasma for now. We're going to stop our recording and we'll start off with the formed elements on Wednesday.